Ancient Egyptian granite work has puzzled people for well over a century, and it's worth being upfront about why. Because the puzzle is real, even if the explanation some people reach for isn't the one most Egyptologists accept. Granite is an igneous rock, formed from cooled magma, and it's genuinely hard, harder than the copper tools ancient Egyptians are documented to have used throughout most of the Old Kingdom period. The era when the majority of the most impressive granite work, sarcophagi, obelisks, statues, temple elements, was actually produced. That basic mismatch, a civilization working stone harder than its known metal tools, sits at the center of a genuine, long-running scholarly and popular disagreement about exactly how they pulled it off. The person most associated with pushing this question into mainstream popular attention is the British author Graham Hancock, known for a series of best-selling books, including Fingerprints of the Gods and Magicians of the Gods, and more recently for the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse. Hancock's broader thesis, laid out across decades of his writing, holds that an advanced global civilization existed during the last ice age, was largely destroyed by a catastrophic event roughly 12,900 years ago, associated with what's known as the Younger Dryas period, and that scattered survivors of that catastrophe passed down fragments of sophisticated knowledge to the hunter-gatherer societies that would later become the first recognized civilizations in places like Egypt, Sumer, and Mesoamerica. Granite cutting fits into this larger framework as one specific piece of supporting evidence. Hancock and like-minded researchers, including the mechanical engineer Christopher Dunn and various online creators, point to arguing that certain features found on Egyptian granite artifacts look too precise, too smooth, or too mechanically consistent to have been produced by hand using only copper tools and abrasive sand, the technique mainstream Egyptology credits. It's worth being clear and specific about what evidence this argument actually rests on, because it isn't invented out of nothing. The most frequently cited piece of physical evidence is a set of drill cores and cut granite fragments, some originally excavated and studied by the pioneering Egyptologist Flinders Petrie in the late 19th century, showing spiral striation marks, thin grooves that curve around the surface in a consistent, evenly spaced pattern, the kind of mark you'd expect from a rotating drill bit cutting into stone. Petrie himself, examining these marks, calculated that producing them would have required significant applied pressure and a drill bit harder than the granite itself, and speculated, in his own 19th century writing, that the ancient Egyptians may have possessed jeweled cutting tools capable of this, though he stopped well short of proposing anything like the lost advanced civilization framework Hancock and others build on top of the same physical observation more than a century later. This is a good example of how a real, documented physical puzzle from legitimate early archaeology gets picked up and extended decades or a century later into a much larger and more speculative theoretical framework than the original observation was ever meant to support on its own. The mainstream Egyptological and experimental archaeology response to this puzzle has focused less on theorizing and more on actually trying to replicate the ancient techniques directly, which is really the only way to settle a question like this with any confidence. The most significant work here comes from Dennis Stocks, a British experimental archaeologist who spent years specifically testing ancient Egyptian stoneworking methods, using only tools and materials that are actually documented and attested from the archaeological record of the relevant period: copper implements, wood, and abrasive sand containing quartz and other hard mineral particles. Stocks demonstrated, through direct physical replication rather than theoretical calculation, that copper tubes and saws used in combination with a loose quartz sand abrasive fed continuously into the cut are genuinely capable of cutting and drilling into granite, including producing the same kind of spiral striation marks that Petrie had documented and that later writers pointed to as evidence of impossible ancient technology. The mechanism is straightforward once you understand it. The copper tool itself isn't actually doing the cutting. It's acting as a soft carrier, dragging much harder loose quartz sand particles across the granite surface under pressure. And it's the sand, not the copper, doing the actual abrasive cutting work. The same basic principle behind sandpaper or modern abrasive cutting wheels, just executed slowly by hand or with a simple rotating drill mechanism over what would have been a genuinely long period of sustained, skilled labor. This distinction matters enormously for evaluating the impossible without advanced technology argument, because it directly addresses the specific objection raised in online discussions and forums dedicated to testing these claims, including detailed technical breakdowns published on sites like Metabunk that have specifically examined and rebutted the copper tool hardness argument. The core rebuttal is straightforward material science. Copper alone, even work-hardened through repeated hammering, genuinely cannot cut granite, and nobody serious on either side of this debate actually disputes that specific point. What the Stock's experimental work and the broader mainstream archaeological consensus argue is that nobody needed copper alone to be hard enough, because the abrasive sand embedded in the cutting process was doing the actual work of scratching through the granite's mineral structure with the copper tool, simply providing a controllable, shapeable mechanism to hold and guide that abrasive material precisely where the ancient craftsmen wanted it applied. It's a genuinely elegant, low-technology solution to a hard material problem, and it's been directly, physically demonstrated to work, not just argued for theoretically. There's a second, equally important piece of physical evidence that tends to get less attention in the more sensational alternative technology videos, and it's sitting in plain sight at one of Egypt's most visited archaeological sites. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan, this massive granite obelisk, abandoned partway through its extraction because a crack developed in the stone during the quarrying process, was left exactly where the ancient work crews left it, still partially attached to the surrounding bedrock, providing archaeologists with something genuinely rare, direct physical evidence of the extraction and shaping process itself, frozen mid-construction rather than reconstructed after the fact from a finished product. Surrounding the obelisk, still lying in the surrounding quarry area, archaeologists have found dolerite pounding stones, a harder volcanic rock used as a simple percussion tool along with clear tool marks on the surrounding granite. Consistent with a labor-intensive pounding and grinding technique, workers using these hard dolerite balls to physically pound and abrade a channel around the obelisk's outline, gradually working it free from the surrounding bedrock through sheer repetitive percussive force rather than any form of cutting tool at all. This is about as close to direct physical proof of method as ancient archaeology ever gets, an unfinished worksite. The actual tools used still present at the scene, showing a technique that required no advanced technology whatsoever. Just an enormous, well-organized labor force applying a simple, physically demonstrated technique with real patience over what would have been a very long production timeline. It's worth being fair to the strongest version of the alternative technology argument here too, rather than just dismissing it outright. Because the honest, even-handed response to Hancock's broader framework isn't that the underlying physical puzzle he points to is fake. The spiral drill marks documented by Petrie are real. Certain examples of Egyptian granite work, particularly some of the finer stone vessels and sarcophagi, really do show a level of surface precision and consistency that took skilled and modern craftspeople, genuine trial and error to fully understand and replicate. Where the mainstream archaeological consensus and the alternative advanced civilization framework genuinely part ways isn't over whether the physical evidence exists, but over what it actually requires as an explanation. Stocks and other experimental archaeologists have shown through direct hands-on replication rather than pure theory that the observed techniques, copper tools carrying abrasive sand, dolerite pounding stones, an enormous, patient, highly organized skilled labor force, and a very long production timeline measured in months or years, per major piece, are sufficient on their own to produce everything currently documented in the surviving Egyptian granite record, without requiring any tool, material, or technology beyond what's already well attested in the broader archaeological record of the period. Hancock's position, by contrast, generally treats this same evidence as more consistent with lost, more mechanically sophisticated technology inherited in fragmentary form from an earlier, largely undocumented civilization, a claim that, as of now, has not been supported by any physical artifact, written record, or independently verifiable archaeological find demonstrating that such tools, or such a civilization, actually existed. It's also relevant in the interest of giving a full and honest picture that Hancock's broader body of work has been widely and specifically characterized as pseudoscientific by mainstream academic archaeology, including formal critique published by scholars specifically examining his catastrophist Ice Age civilization framework and its relationship to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a real, separate, and still genuinely debated scientific question in its own right about a possible ancient comet impact event, one that exists as legitimate ongoing geological research completely independent of the much larger, more speculative, civilizational claims Hancock builds on top of it. That academic characterization doesn't mean every individual observation Hancock or his fellow alternative technology researchers raise is automatically wrong. Plenty of genuine archaeological puzzles have been first flagged by outsiders or amateurs working outside. Formal academic structures and Petrie's own original 19th century observations about the drill marks are a good example of a legitimate puzzle that started exactly that way. What it does mean is that when a specific claim, like ancient Egyptians requiring technology beyond copper and abrasive sand to work granite, has been directly, physically tested and replicated, using only documented ancient period tools and found to actually work, the burden of evidence sits with anyone still arguing that a more advanced, undiscovered technology was nonetheless required. And so far, that additional evidence hasn't materialized in any form that's held up to independent scientific review. What makes this a genuinely worthwhile topic to cover carefully, rather than either fully dismissing it or presenting the more sensational version uncritically, is that the real answer, sitting underneath all of this online noise, is legitimately impressive on its own terms, arguably more impressive than an unproven lost technology explanation would be. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen, working with materials and tools that are well documented, extensively studied, and have now been directly physically replicated by modern experimental. Archaeologists figured out how to shape and finish some of the hardest natural stone available to them, using nothing more exotic than copper, patience, an abundant local supply of quartz sand, and an enormous, highly organized workforce capable of sustaining labor-intensive projects across months and years at a time. That's not a mystery requiring a lost civilization to explain. It's a genuine testament to how far patient, skilled, low-technology craftsmanship can actually go when a society has the organizational capacity and the sustained will to commit enormous amounts of coordinated human effort to a single difficult goal, which, when you actually sit with it honestly, might be an even more remarkable story than the one currently circulating in a wave of videos that never happened to be endorsed by anyone who's actually said it.